In the year 1258, in a stone monastery perched on the gentle hills of Yorkshire, a time came when summer never truly arrived. Brother Thomas, 29 years old, with ink-stained fingers and close-cropped dark hair, worked in the Scriptorium as the world outside grew colder than anyone could remember. His days passed in the careful copying of texts, the quiet rhythm of his quill against vellum, and the peaceful routines that marked monastic life, even as the seasons seemed to forget their usual dance. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to this English monastery in Yorkshire, where we will follow Brother Thomas through his daily tasks of copying manuscripts, tending to his work, and finding comfort in routine during an unusually cold year. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The morning bell had rung for prime, its deep tone rolling across the cloister garden where frost still clung to the herb beds, even though it was well into June. Brother Thomas moved from his small sleeping cell toward the Scriptorium, his woolen habit brushing against the worn stone of the passageway. The air held a crisp coolness that belonged more to early spring than to midsummer, and he could see his breath making faint clouds in the dim light. His ink-stained fingers, perpetually marked from years of careful work, adjusted the hood of his habit against the unusual chill. The Scriptorium waited with its familiar stillness. Tall windows of thick glass, a luxury afforded by the monastery's wealthy patron, let in the pale gray light of an overcast dawn. The room smelled of old parchment, oak gall ink, and the beeswax candles that burned in their iron holders even during daylight hours. Brother Thomas settled onto his wooden bench at the copying desk he had occupied for 7 years, the seat worn smooth by the gentle pressure of his daily presence. The vellum sheet before him was smooth calfskin, prepared weeks earlier, and ready to receive the text he would copy from the exemplar propped on its stand. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, a habit formed over years of practice. The low, soothing notes of the Kyrie eleison drifted from his lips as he examined his quills, selecting one with a tip neither too broad nor too fine. The rhythm of the chant matched the slow deliberation of his movements, testing the quill against a scrap of practice vellum, checking the consistency of the ink in its horn container, positioning the pumice stone within easy reach should he need to make corrections. Everything had its place, every motion its purpose, and Thomas found a deep contentment in this ordering of materials and time. Outside, the world remained locked in its strange coldness. Brother Thomas could hear the wind moving through the cloister garden, rustling leaves that should have been lush with summer growth, but instead seemed hesitant, stunted. Through the thick glass he could see the apple trees in the orchard beyond, their branches heavy not with ripening fruit, but with an abundance of small, green globes that refused to swell and redden. The monastery's fields, visible in the distance where the land rolled down toward the river valley, showed crops that struggled in the persistent chill and absence of true sunlight. Thomas dipped his quill into the ink with measured care. The first letter of the new page would be a decorated capital, and he had spent the previous evening mixing vermilion pigment with egg tempera, creating a red so rich it seemed to hold warmth within itself, a small defiance of the cold that pressed against the monastery walls. His hand moved with the patience learned through thousands of hours of practice, forming the curved line of a letter C, the beginning of a psalm. The ink flowed smoothly, darkening as it dried, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of a clean line, properly formed. The scriptorium filled gradually with soft sounds. Brother Martin, 41 years old with silver-streaked brown hair and a contemplative silence, entered and took his place at the adjacent desk. He nodded to Thomas but did not speak, the rule of silence held during working hours, broken only for necessity or the hours of communal prayer. The scratch of quills against vellum became a quiet music, punctuated by the occasional soft thud of a pumice stone smoothing an error, the whisper of a page turning in an exemplar, the creak of a wooden stool as weight shifted. Thomas worked through the morning with unhurried focus. Each letter received his full attention, from the broad strokes of verticals to the delicate serifs that finished each character. His ink-stained fingers held the quill with a lightness that came from long familiarity, applying just enough pressure to let the ink flow without spreading or feathering on the prepared surface. Between letters, he would pause, examining what he had written, comparing it to the exemplar, ensuring that his copy maintained fidelity to the original text while also carrying the subtle stamp of his own careful hand. When the bell rang for Terce, the mid-morning office, Thomas set down his quill and rose from his bench. His body had settled into the work, and standing brought a pleasant awareness of muscles that had been still. He flexed his ink-stained fingers, noticing as he always did the slight stiffness that came with the work, the familiar ache that was never quite pain, but rather the body's acknowledgement of sustained effort. The coolness of the air followed him as he joined the other brothers in their slow procession toward the church. The church itself felt warmer than the scriptorium, warmed by the bodies of the gathered community and the residual heat from the morning's fire in the chapter house nearby. The brothers' voices rose in unison, chanting the psalms appointed for the hour. Thomas found his voice blending with the others, individual tones merging into a single sound that filled the stone space. The chant required nothing of him except presence, no decisions, no variations, just the steady unfolding of ancient words in their appointed rhythm. His mind rested in this, floating on the current of sound, aware of the cold morning but not troubled by it. After the office, the community moved to the refectory for a simple meal. The long tables, worn smooth by years of use, held wooden bowls filled with thick pottage. Barley and beans cooked slowly over the kitchen fire until they merged into a warming, savory mass. Brother Thomas ate without hurry, using a wooden spoon to lift the food to his mouth, tasting the earthiness of the grain, the subtle seasoning of salt and herbs from the monastery garden. The coolness outside made the warm food especially comforting, and he noticed the steam rising from his bowl, curling upward in the dim light that filtered through the refectory's narrow windows. Bread accompanied the pottage, dense rye bread with a crust that crackled when broken. Thomas held a piece in his hand, feeling its weight, the roughness of the crust against his palm before he bit into it. The interior was moist, slightly sour in the way of well-made rye, and he chewed slowly, attentive to the texture and taste. A cup of small ale, mild and slightly sweet, completed the meal. He drank it in small sips, letting it wash away the residue of bread and pottage, preparing his palate for the afternoon's work. The walk back to the Scriptorium took him through the cloister garden once more. Thomas paused for a moment in the covered walkway, looking out at the small plots where medicinal and culinary herbs grew. Brother Anselm, the infirmarian, was kneeling by the bed of feverfew, his weathered hands gentle as they checked the plants for readiness. The usual abundance of summer was absent. The plants grew, but slowly, their leaves smaller than in other years, their flowering delayed. Still, Anselm tended them with the same patient care he brought to all his charges, trusting that they would provide what was needed in their own time. Back at his desk, Thomas examined the morning's work. The page had progressed well, perhaps a third complete, with the decorated initial standing out in its vermilion glory against the disciplined rows of black text below. He felt a quiet pride in the work, not the sharp satisfaction of accomplishment, but rather the steady contentment that came from doing a task well, from maintaining standards, from adding his small contribution to the monastery's great work of preserving and transmitting knowledge. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, letting the familiar tunes guide his breath and steady his hand as he prepared to continue. The afternoon light, such as it was, came slanting through the windows at a gentler angle. Thomas continued his copying, moving through the verses of the psalm with measured progress. The text spoke of God's faithfulness through changing seasons, and Thomas found himself pondering the words as he formed them. This strange year, with its absent summer and persistent cold, seemed itself a kind of season. Not winter, not summer, but something in between, something that required its own kind of patience and trust. His hand moved steadily, creating letters, building words, constructing lines that would outlast this unusual year and many others to come. Brother Martin, at the next desk, paused in his own work to prepare fresh ink. Thomas watched from the corner of his eye as his fellow scribe crushed oak galls in a small mortar, the dried growths from oak trees powdering into a fine tan dust. Martin added iron vitriol, creating the chemical reaction that would produce the permanent black ink they all used. The smell was astringent, metallic, mixing with the ever-present sense of vellum and wax. Martin worked with the same unhurried thoroughness that characterized all the monastery's tasks, and Thomas returned to his own page, comforted by the parallel rhythms of their shared labor. The hours passed in this way, marked not by anxiety over time, but by the gradual accumulation of completed lines, the slow darkening of vellum as text covered its surface. Thomas's ink-stained fingers held the quill with unchanging steadiness. His posture settled into the gentle curve that allowed hours of work without excessive strain. His close-cropped dark hair, practical for monastic life, needed no attention, and his simple woolen habit required no adjustment. Everything about his person and his work was arranged for this: the quiet, sustained attention to copying sacred and scholarly texts. When the bell rang for none, the afternoon office, Thomas had completed another section of the page. He cleaned his quill carefully, wiping the tip on a scrap of linen kept for that purpose, then laid it aside. The procession to church felt like a gentle stretch, a purposeful movement after stillness. The office itself was brief, the prayers familiar, and Thomas found himself back at his desk before the light had shifted noticeably in the scriptorium. The final hours of the working day carried their own particular quality. The light grew thinner, the pale gray of the overcast sky deepening toward evening. Thomas lit the candles at his desk, their warm glow creating a circle of illumination that pushed back the gathering dimness. The flame tips wavered slightly in the imperceptible currents of air that moved through even this sheltered space, and the smell of beeswax added its sweetness to the complex scentscape of the room. In this golden light, the Vermillion initially seemed to glow, the black text appearing even more crisp against the cream-colored vellum. Brother Thomas worked until Vespers, the evening office. By then, the page was nearly complete. Only a few more lines remained, and those he would finish on the morrow. He cleaned his workspace with the same care he brought to the copying itself, wiping the desk surface, arranging his tools in their proper places, covering the ink horn to prevent evaporation and contamination. His hands, marked permanently by years of this work, performed these small rituals with practiced ease, each motion economical and sufficient. The church was darker now, and more candles had been lit for Vespers. Their flames multiplied in the shadowed space, creating pockets of warmth and light. The evening psalms had a different quality than those of the morning, a sense of completion, of work concluded, of the day's labors being gathered and offered. Thomas sang with the community, his voice steady, his mind already beginning to release the day's detailed focus and settle into the gentler awareness of evening. His deep contentment, the baseline of his interior life, rose to conscious recognition. This was good work, good community, good order. The evening meal in the refectory was similar to the midday repast, pottage, bread, ale, but with the addition of cheese, a firm yellow cheese from the monastery's own dairy. Thomas cut a piece with his eating knife, the blade clean and sharp, and ate it with bread, savoring the richness that balanced the simpler flavors of the pottage. The combination was satisfying, substantial enough to carry him through the evening offices and the night's sleep. Around him, his brothers ate in companionable silence, faces softened by the glow of rush lights that flickered in their wall sconces. After Compline, the day's final office, the monastery settled into the great silence that would last until prime the next morning. Brother Thomas walked through the darkened cloister toward his cell, his footsteps quiet on the stone paving. The air was cold again, the brief warmth of the refectory already a memory. Above, through breaks in the cloud cover, a few stars were visible, their light seeming especially bright in the deep darkness of this midsummer night that felt like autumn. His cell was small and simple, a narrow bed with a straw mattress and woolen blankets, a small table with a candle, a wooden cross on the wall. Thomas removed his outer habit and lay down on the bed, pulling the blankets over himself against the chill. The wool was scratchy but warm, and his body, tired from the day's sustained focus, relaxed into the familiar contours of the mattress. He thought briefly of the page waiting in the scriptorium, nearly complete, requiring only a few more lines. Tomorrow would bring its completion, and then the start of a new page, and then another, the work continuing in its steady progression regardless of what strangeness the weather might bring. The morning arrived with the same gray coolness, the light filtering through Brother Thomas's small window without warmth or brightness. He woke before the bell, as was his habit, and lay for a moment under the woolen blankets, feeling the weight of them, the way they held his body's heat against the chill air of the cell. His breath made small clouds in the darkness, visible in the faint pre-dawn light. When the bell finally rang for prime, he rose and dressed, his movements practiced and economical, requiring no thought. The walk to the church took him past the kitchen, where Brother Aelred had already begun the day's baking. The scent of bread drifted through the cold air, yeast and grain, the wholesome smell of sustenance being prepared. Thomas breathed it in as he passed, letting the warmth of it enter his lungs, a small comfort against the unseasonable cold. In the church, the brothers gathered as they did every morning, their voices joining in the psalms appointed for prime, the words creating a shelter of sound and shared purpose that needed no explanation. After the office, Thomas went directly to the Scriptorium. The room held the accumulated cold of the night, and he was grateful for the layers of his habit. He lit the candles at his desk, watching as the flames took hold and steadied, their light pushing back the gloom. The page from yesterday waited where he had left it, the text marching in orderly lines across the vellum, the vermilion initially catching the candlelight and seeming to pulse with its own inner radiance. He examined his quills, selected the same one he had used the previous day, and tested it on a scrap of vellum to ensure the tip was still properly shaped. The remaining lines of the psalm took perhaps an hour to complete. Thomas worked with the same measured attention he brought to all his copying, each letter receiving its full due. His ink-stained fingers guided the quill with gentle pressure, the scratch of metal on parchment, a sound so familiar it was almost a part of silence itself. When the final word was formed and the page complete, he sat back and looked at it as a whole, checking the alignment of the text block, the consistency of the letter forms, and the cleanliness of the margins. It was good work, honest and careful, and he felt the quiet satisfaction that came with completion. Brother Martin entered the Scriptorium carrying an armload of vellum sheets, freshly prepared and ready for use. His silver-streaked brown hair caught the candlelight as he moved past Thomas's desk, and he paused to glance at the completed page. He nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before continuing to his own workspace. The two scribes had worked side by side for years, and this minimal communication carried weight. Martin's nod was approval, recognition of work done well according to the standards they both maintained. Thomas began preparing the next sheet. He placed it on his desk and smoothed it with his palm, feeling the slight grain of the calfskin, checking for any imperfections that might catch the quill or cause the ink to spread unevenly. Finding none, he ruled the page with a lead point, creating the faint guidelines that would keep his text straight and evenly spaced. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not intense concentration, and his mind drifted pleasantly as his hands performed the familiar tasks. He thought of the cold outside, the absent summer, the crops struggling in the fields, not with worry but with a kind of wondering acceptance. Some years were like this, beyond understanding, requiring patience. By the time Terce arrived, he had ruled 2 pages and begun the decorative work on the initial letter of the first. This would be a more elaborate capital than yesterday's, incorporating vine scrollwork and tiny flourishes that would catch the eye without overwhelming the text. Thomas mixed blue pigment, precious ultramarine made from lapis lazuli, ground to powder and mixed with binding medium. The color was so rich it seemed to contain depth, as though one could fall into it. He applied it sparingly with a finer brush, building up the color in thin layers that would dry to a brilliant, enduring blue. The mid-morning office interrupted this delicate work, but Thomas welcomed the break. His eyes had been focused closely on the small details of the illumination, and the walk to church, the lifting of his voice in prayer, brought a different kind of awareness. The church was cold despite the gathering of bodies, and Thomas noticed that some of the older brothers pulled their hoods up against the chill even inside the building. Brother Columba, 63 years old with a face weathered by decades of monastic labor, coughed occasionally during the psalms, a dry sound that echoed briefly in the stone space before being absorbed. The midday meal brought warmth through food again. Today's pottage had been enriched with dried peas and small pieces of salt pork, the fat adding richness to the broth. Thomas ate slowly, using bread to sop up the liquid, letting the warmth travel down his throat and settle in his stomach. The simple pleasure of a hot meal on a cold day was not something to rush through. Brother Aelred, who had baked the morning's bread, sat across from Thomas, and there was a moment of eye contact between them, baker and scribe, each contributing to the community's life in their own way, each finding meaning in the work of their hands. Afternoon found Thomas back at his illumination work. The blue initial now had its base layers complete, and he began adding white highlights mixed from lead white and glare, beaten egg white that served as a binder. The tiny touches of white created the illusion of dimension, making the flat surface of the vellum seem to hold a letter that curved and caught light. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, the familiar tunes providing a rhythm that guided his breath and steadied his hand. The Kyrie gave way to the Gloria, then to verses from the Psalter, an endless internal soundtrack that required no conscious thought. Brother Martin, at his desk, had begun copying a different text, a treatise on the cultivation of medicinal herbs. Thomas could see from the corner of his eye that Martin was making marginal illustrations, small drawings of the plants being described. The elder scribe had a gift for such work, capturing the essential character of each plant with just a few economical lines. Thomas watched as a drawing of comfrey took shape, the broad leaves unmistakable even in miniature. There was comfort in working alongside someone so skilled, in being part of a tradition that valued both precision and beauty. The hours of afternoon passed in absorbed attention. Thomas completed the blue initial and moved on to the body of the text, the straightforward copying that would fill the rest of the page. His hand found its rhythm, the familiar flow of letter after letter, word after word. The exemplar he was copying from was itself beautiful, a manuscript created perhaps 50 years earlier by scribes whose names were lost but whose skill lived on in every careful stroke. Thomas felt connected to them as he copied, his work a continuation of theirs, part of an unbroken chain of transmission that stretched back through centuries. When his hand began to tire, Thomas paused and set down his quill. He stood and stretched, feeling the slight stiffness in his shoulders and lower back that came from sustained sitting. The scriptorium had warmed slightly as the day progressed, or perhaps he had simply grown accustomed to the chill. He walked to one of the windows and looked out at the cloister garden. Brother Anselm was there again, working among the herb beds, his movements slow and deliberate as he weeded around the sage plants. The infirmarian's patience was remarkable. He never hurried, never seemed frustrated by tasks that would take weeks to show results. Thomas returned to his desk refreshed. The brief movement had eased the tightness in his muscles, and his ink-stained fingers felt ready to continue. He checked his ink supply and found it adequate, the dark liquid still fluid and properly mixed. The afternoon light, such as it was, slanted across his workspace at an angle that cast interesting shadows from the candle holders. He positioned himself to take advantage of both candle and daylight, maximizing the illumination on his working surface. The page progressed steadily, each line added to the ones before, the text block growing like a building being constructed, stone upon stone. Thomas found deep contentment in this growth, this visible evidence of time spent purposefully. The words he copied spoke of God's care for creation, the way divine providence attended to all things great and small. Writing them, forming each letter with care, felt like a kind of prayer, not the formal prayers of the offices, but a wordless offering of attention and skill. Brother Martin rose from his desk and approached Thomas, carrying the page he had been illuminating. Without speaking, the rule of silence still held. He showed Thomas his work. The drawings of herbs were exquisite, each plant rendered with botanical accuracy and artistic grace. Thomas nodded his appreciation, and Martin's weathered face creased in a slight smile before he returned to his own desk. These small moments of sharing, of mutual recognition, punctuated the long hours of solitary focus and made them richer. None came and passed, the afternoon office brief and restorative. Thomas returned to find that the scriptorium had grown noticeably darker, the gray day fatting toward evening earlier than it should in midsummer. He lit additional candles, creating a bright island of light around his workspace. The smell of beeswax grew stronger, mixing with the sense of parchment and ink to create the distinctive atmosphere of the scriptorium, a smell that meant learning, preservation, continuity. The final hours of the workday carried a different energy. Thomas knew he would not finish the current page today, but he could bring it close to completion, leaving only a few lines for tomorrow morning. He worked with steady focus, his close-cropped dark hair occasionally falling forward when he leaned close to examine a letter, his ink-stained fingers holding the quill with practiced ease. The world outside the circle of candlelight seemed to fade, leaving only the vellum, the text, the careful formation of letters that would outlast both the cold and whoever was present to feel it. Vespers arrived with an invitation to pause and gather. Thomas cleaned his quill and workspace, performing each small task with the attention it deserved. The walk to church took him through corridors now quite dark, lit only by occasional rush lights that flickered in their sconces. Other brothers moved through the gloom like shadows, all converging toward the church and the light that waited there. The evening psalms spoke of darkness and light, of rest after labor, of trust in the rhythms that governed life. The evening meal included a piece of fish, salted cod that had been soaked to remove excess salt, then baked with herbs. Thomas ate it slowly, tasting the flakiness of the flesh, the subtle seasoning of thyme and rosemary from the monastery garden. The fish was accompanied by turnips, roasted until their edges caramelized slightly, offering sweetness to balance the salt of the cod. He chewed thoughtfully, aware of the textures, the way the food nourished not just his body, but also provided a kind of sensory comfort against the day's persistent chill. After Compline, Thomas walked to his cell through air that had grown colder still. The clouds had thinned somewhat, and he could see more stars than the previous night, their ancient light seeming closer in the crisp air. He thought about the work waiting for him tomorrow, the remaining lines on today's page, the new page that would follow, the steady progression of the manuscript toward completion. It would take months, perhaps a year, but time was not the point. The work itself was the point, the doing of it with care and attention, the contribution to something larger than any single person. In his cell, Thomas prepared for sleep with the same orderliness he brought to all tasks. He removed his outer garments, folded them, and placed them on the small table. The bed was cold when he first lay down, but the woolen blankets trapped his body's warmth and soon created a cocoon of comfort. He lay still, feeling his breathing slow, his muscles releasing the day's holding. Tomorrow would bring another day much like this one, prayers and work and prayers, the reliable pattern that gave shape to time and meaning to effort. Sleep came gradually, gently, like fog settling over the valley. Thomas's last conscious thought was of the blue initial he had illuminated, the rich color that seemed to hold light within itself, a small point of beauty created with care and offered without expectation of recognition. His breathing deepened, his body settled more fully into the mattress, and the great silence of the monastery embraced him as it embraced all his brothers, a silence that was not empty but full of shared purpose, mutual care, and the peace that came from lives ordered toward something beyond themselves. The night passed slowly, measured by the distant bells that marked the hours for those who kept vigil. Thomas slept deeply, his body recovering from the day's sustained focus, his mind resting in the knowledge that tomorrow would provide another opportunity for the work he had been called to do. Outside, the cold deepened, frost forming on every surface, the unseasonable chill continuing its strange hold on the land. But inside the thick stone walls of the monastery, warmth persisted, the warmth of community, of purpose, of lives lived with intention and care. Morning returned with its familiar rhythms. Brother Thomas woke to the sound of the bell calling the community to prime, and he rose from his bed feeling the stiffness that came from a night's rest in the cold. His muscles protested slightly as he stretched, but the discomfort was minor, easily dismissed. He dressed in the darkness, his hands finding each garment by touch and habit, and made his way through the cloister toward the church. The stone beneath his feet was icy, and he could see his breath hanging in the air, visible even in the faint light that preceded dawn. The church gathered the brothers into its familiar embrace. Their voices rose together in the morning psalms, the sound filling the stone space with warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. Thomas sang without thinking about the words, his voice finding its place in the communal sound, his mind still soft with sleep but his body present and attentive. The ritual of the office required only participation, not analysis, and he gave himself to it completely, letting the ancient words wash over and through him. After prime, Thomas went to the Scriptorium while most of the other brothers moved toward the refectory for breakfast. He preferred to work for an hour in the early morning quiet before taking food, finding that his mind was clearest then, his hand most steady. The Scriptorium was deeply cold, and he lit candles not just for light, but for the small warmth they provided. The flames wavered as they caught, then steadied, and Thomas settled onto his bench with a sense of homecoming. This was where he belonged, where his gifts found their proper use. The page from yesterday waited, nearly complete. Thomas examined it in the candlelight, checking the quality of yesterday's work with fresh eyes. The blue initially pleased him. The color was rich, and even the white highlights creating dimension without overpowering the basic form. The text that followed was clean and regular, each letter properly formed and spaced. He picked up his quill, tested it, and began the final lines that would complete the page. His ink-stained fingers held the tool with the same gentle firmness they had held it yesterday, and would hold it tomorrow, the grip that came from years of practice and needed no conscious adjustment. The work went smoothly. The remaining lines filled in without incident, the text reaching its natural conclusion at a point that left the bottom margin properly proportioned. Thomas set down his quill and looked at the completed page with quiet satisfaction. Another page finished, another small contribution to the great work of preserving knowledge and beauty. He would let it dry thoroughly before adding it to the growing stack of completed sheets that would eventually be bound into a finished manuscript. Brother Aelred appeared in the doorway of the Scriptorium, his round face flushed from the heat of the kitchen. He carried a wooden bowl covered with a cloth, and when he set it on Thomas's desk and pulled back the covering, steam rose from the porridge within. Warm oats cooked with honey and a pinch of salt, topped with a pat of butter that was beginning to melt into golden pools. Thomas smiled his thanks. The rule of silence prevented spoken gratitude, but Aelred understood and nodded before departing. The baker's kindness in bringing food to those who worked through the breakfast hour was characteristic of the man, a small thoughtfulness that made community life gentler. Thomas ate the porridge slowly, savoring the warmth and sweetness. The butter added richness, the honey provided comfort, and the oats themselves were substantial and satisfying. He ate with the same attention he brought to his copying, aware of each spoonful, grateful for the nourishment. The warmth of the food spread through him, and by the time the bowl was empty, he felt ready for the day's work. He wiped the bowl clean with a piece of bread that Aelred had tucked under the cloth, eating this too, wasting nothing. The next page required preparation. Thomas selected a fresh sheet of vellum from the stack kept in a wooden chest, protecting it from moisture and dust. He examined the sheet carefully, holding it up to the candlelight, checking for any flaws in the preparation, thin spots, remaining hairs, uneven thickness. Finding it acceptable, he laid it on his desk and began the ruling process. The lead point moved across the surface, creating faint lines that would guide his text. The work was almost automatic, his hands knowing exactly where each line should fall, the spacing maintained by muscle memory rather than conscious calculation. Brother Martin arrived and took his place at the adjacent desk. He brought with him a different energy today, not troublesome, but somehow more present, more animated than usual. Thomas glanced over and saw that Martin had been assigned to copy a treatise on beekeeping, and the elder scribe's face showed a quiet eagerness. Martin had kept bees himself before entering the monastery, and returning to knowledge of them through copying clearly brought him pleasure. Thomas felt gladness for his fellow scribe, understanding how certain texts could resonate more deeply than others. The morning progressed in companionable silence. Thomas began the initial letter of his new page, a large letter S that would eventually be decorated with intricate knotwork. For now, he simply formed the basic shape in light pencil, planning the design before committing to ink and pigment. The S curved gracefully, its proportions balanced, offering space within its loops for the decorative elements he would add later. He stepped back mentally from the work, seeing it with a designer's eye, making small adjustments until the form satisfied him. Terce interrupted his planning, calling him to the mid-morning office. The walk to church took him past the chapter house, where he could hear Brother Anselm speaking quietly with Brother Columba about the elder monk's persistent cough. The infirmarian's voice was calm and reassuring, discussing herbal remedies and rest, his tone carrying the certainty of long experience. Thomas continued in the past, not eavesdropping, but comforted by the evidence of care, the way the community attended to its members' needs without fuss or anxiety. The office was brief, and Thomas found himself back at his desk with most of the morning still ahead. He mixed ink fresh. The batch from yesterday was still good, but he preferred to work with newly prepared ink for important work, finding that it flowed more smoothly and dried to a more consistent black. He crushed oak galls in his small mortar, the brittle growths breaking into fragments and then powder under the pressure of the pestle. The addition of iron vitriol created the chemical reaction that produced ink, and he added gum arabic to give it proper viscosity. The smell was sharp and mineral, cutting through the sweeter scents of wax and parchment. With fresh ink prepared, Thomas began the actual copying of text on his new page. The example he worked from was a collection of saints' lives, and today's portion concerned Saint Benedict, the founder of Western monasticism. Thomas knew the story well, every monk did, but copying it letter by letter, word by word, brought a different kind of familiarity. He noticed small details in the text that he had never registered before, turns of phrase that revealed the anonymous author's craft, theological emphases that shaped the telling. His quill moved steadily, and the text began to accumulate, black ink on cream vellum, knowledge preserved and transmitted. The midday meal brought the community together in the refectory. Today's pottage was barley-based, thick with vegetables from the monastery's stores, carrots, onions, and cabbage that had been kept in the cool cellar since autumn. The vegetables had softened in the long cooking, their flavors melding into the rich broth. Thomas ate with his usual attention, using bread to capture every bit of liquid, chewing thoroughly, letting the food settle in his stomach before taking the next spoonful. Around him, his brothers ate with similar focus, the silence of the meal broken only by the sound of spoons against wooden bowls and the occasional scrape of a bench against the stone floor. After the meal, Thomas walked briefly in the cloister before returning to the Scriptorium. The cold air helped clear his mind, and the movement loosened muscles that had tightened during the morning's work. He observed the garden as he walked. Brother Anselm had been working there again, and the herb beds showed evidence of his care. The plants were still struggling in the unseasonable cold, but they were weeded and mulched, given every advantage the infirmary could provide. Thomas admired this patience, this faithful tending even when results were uncertain. The afternoon's work began with the decoration of the S initial. Thomas had decided on a Celtic knotwork pattern, the interlacing strands that symbolized eternity and interconnection. He worked first in pencil, sketching the over-under pattern of the strands, ensuring that each crossing was consistent, that the design flowed without breaks or errors. The mathematics of knotwork were subtle. One wrong crossing could ruin the entire pattern, but Thomas had done this work many times and his hand was sure. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, the familiar tunes providing a meditative background to the detailed task. When the pencil sketch satisfied him, Thomas began applying ink. He used a very fine quill for this work, one with a tip he had shaped specifically for detail work. The ink lines had to be clean and definite, neither too thick nor too thin, maintaining consistent weight throughout the pattern. He worked with absolute focus, his breathing slow and regular, his hand moving with deliberate precision. Each strand of the knotwork emerged distinct and clear, weaving over and under its neighbors in the timeless pattern that had decorated manuscripts for centuries. Brother Martin paused in his own work to watch. Thomas sensed his presence but did not break concentration. This phase of the work required uninterrupted attention. When he finally completed the ink work and set down his quill, Martin nodded with evident appreciation. The elder scribe understood the difficulty of what Thomas had accomplished, the skill required to execute such work flawlessly. The moment of recognition passed without words, but it warmed Thomas more than the candles could. This acknowledgement from someone whose judgment he valued. The remainder of the page was straightforward copying, and Thomas moved through it with steady rhythm. The text of Saint Benedict's life unfolded line by line. His early years, his flight from Rome to the cave at Subiaco, his founding of Monte Cassino, the writing of the rule that governed Benedictine life throughout Christendom. Thomas copied each event with equal care, not rushing through familiar material, but giving it the same attention he would give to text he had never encountered. Every word mattered, every letter deserved proper formation. As afternoon faded toward evening, Thomas became aware of changes in the light outside. The clouds that had covered the sky for days seemed to be thinning, and occasionally a shaft of actual sunlight would break through, striking the cloister garden with surprising intensity. The light was golden and warm-looking, though it brought no actual warmth to the cold air. Still, its appearance felt significant, as though the strange weather might finally be shifting toward something more normal. Thomas glanced out the window when these moments occurred, watching the play of light and shadow, the way it transformed the familiar garden into something briefly magical. None arrived, and Thomas welcomed the interruption. His eyes were tired from the close work of the knotwork, and his shoulders held tension from maintaining the careful posture that detail work required. The office gave him an opportunity to release this holding, to lift his voice and move his body through the familiar ritual. The church seemed less cold than it had in previous days, or perhaps he was simply adjusting to the new normal of persistent chill. Either way, the discomfort was minimal, easily borne. The final working hours brought their own satisfaction. Thomas completed another significant section of text, bringing the page close to its planned endpoint. Tomorrow he will finish it and begin yet another page, the process continuing in its reliable cycle. He felt no impatience with this repetition. Indeed, the repetition was part of what gave the work meaning. Each page was both unique and part of a larger whole, just as each day was both its own entity and part of the greater rhythm of monastic life. Vespers found the community gathering as the natural light outside finally failed. The church was warm with candlelight, dozens of flames creating a golden glow that softened every surface. The evening psalm spoke of God's faithfulness, of promises kept across generations, of hope that endured through darkness. Thomas sang with his brothers, his voice steady, his heart quiet with the deep contentment that was his baseline state. This was good, all of it. The cold and the work, the community and the silence, the particular beauty of this moment, and the reliability of moments yet to come. The evening meal brought roasted root vegetables, parsnips and turnips that had caramelized in the oven, their natural sugars concentrating and browning. Thomas ate them with coarse bread, the sweetness of the vegetables contrasting pleasantly with the hearty simplicity of the bread. A bowl of bean pottage accompanied the meal, its warmth settling in his stomach and spreading through his limbs. He ate without hurry, grateful for the food, aware of the labor that had brought it to this table, the planting and tending, the harvesting and storing, the cooking and serving. After Compline, Thomas noticed that the stars were fully visible for the first time in many days. The clouds had cleared almost completely, leaving the night sky vast and brilliant above the monastery. He paused in the cloister to look up, his neck tilted back, his eyes taking in the countless points of light. The cold was sharper without clouds to hold in any warmth, and his breath made clouds that obscured the stars briefly before dissolving. He stood there for several minutes, simply looking, simply present to the beauty overhead. In his cell, Thomas prepared for sleep with his usual care. He folded his day clothes and set them aside, then slipped under the woolen blankets that were piled thick against the cold. His body was tired in the good way that came from a day fully lived, from work completed and community shared. His ink-stained fingers relaxed against the rough linen of the sheet, and his close-cropped dark hair pressed against the pillow stuffed with straw. He thought briefly of the knotwork initially he had completed, its interlacing strands perfect and eternal, and then his thoughts became less focused, drifting like smoke toward sleep. The monastery settled into the night around him. In other cells, his brothers were likewise preparing for rest, their days also complete, their work also ongoing. The stone walls held the accumulated prayers of centuries, the careful labor of countless monks who had lived and worked and prayed in this place. Thomas felt connected to them all, part of an unbroken chain of dedication and service. Tomorrow would bring another day much like this one, and he welcomed it, trusted it, rested in the knowledge that his life had purpose and pattern. Sleep came easily, pulling him down into its restoring darkness. His breathing slowed and deepened. His muscles released their holding, and his mind let go of conscious thought. The cold night continued outside, the stars wheeling slowly overhead in their ancient dance, but Thomas was warm enough, safe enough, at peace. The great silence enfolded him as it enfolded the entire community, a silence that was not absence but presence, not emptiness but fullness, not isolation but the deepest kind of communion. The dawn came clearer than it had in weeks. Brother Thomas woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the narrow window of his cell, creating a rectangular pattern on the stone floor. The light was thin and cool, lacking the warmth that summer sun should carry, but after so many days of unrelieved gray, even this pallid brightness felt like a blessing. He lay still for a moment, watching dust motes drift through the beam of light, their slow movement mesmerizing in its simplicity. When the bell rang for prime, he rose with a sense of renewed energy, as though the clearing sky had somehow cleared something within him as well. The church held the gathered community as it always did, but this morning the light through the windows was different. The thick glass, usually admitting only dim and colorless illumination, now showed hints of the world outside, the suggestion of blue sky, the shadow of a tree branch moving in wind. The Psalms seemed to carry differently in this changed light, the words about mourning and renewal taking on fresh resonance. Thomas sang with his full voice, his deep contentment expressing itself in sound, in the blending of his breath with the breath of his brothers. After prime, Thomas returned to his cell briefly to collect a warmer cloak. Despite the clear sky, the air remained cold, and he knew he would be working in the Scriptorium for hours. The additional layer of wool would help maintain the steady warmth his body needed for sustained focus. He wrapped it around his shoulders, fastening it with the simple wooden toggle that secured it at his throat, and made his way through the cloister toward the morning meal. The refectory held the mingled scents of porridge and fresh bread. Brother Aelred had baked extra this morning, perhaps inspired by the clearing weather, and the loaves lined a side table in abundant rows. Thomas took his place at the long table and waited as porridge was ladled into his bowl, oats cooked with dried apples that had been stored since autumn, their sweetness a pleasant surprise. He ate slowly, the fruit providing bursts of concentrated flavor amid the creamy grain. The bread, when he broke into it, released steam and the yeasty smell of fermentation, and he ate 2 thick slices, feeling the food settle warmly in his belly. The walk to the Scriptorium took him past the kitchen garden, where Brother Anselm was examining the early morning frost that still clung to the plants despite the sunshine. The infirmarian's weathered face was thoughtful as he touched a sage leaf, feeling the ice crystals that coated it. Thomas paused to observe, and Anselm looked up, his expression saying what words could not during the hours of silence, concern for the plants, but also acceptance of what could not be changed. Thomas nodded understanding and continued on his way, carrying with him the image of that gentle, calloused hand touching frozen leaves with such care. The Scriptorium welcomed him with its familiar atmosphere. The sunlight streaming through the windows transformed the space, making visible details usually lost in shadow, the grain of the wooden desks, the texture of the stone walls, the accumulated dust on the higher shelves where older manuscripts rested. Thomas lit fewer candles than usual, finding that the natural light was sufficient for his work. He settled onto his bench and examined the page from yesterday. The knotwork initially looked even better in the clear morning light, its interlacing pattern crisp and balanced, the black ink standing out sharply against the cream vellum. He picked up his quill and began the day's copying. The text continued Saint Benedict's life story, moving into the years at Monte Cassino, when the saint was establishing the patterns of monastic life that would shape Western Christianity. Thomas copied each word with attention, his ink-stained fingers guiding the quill in the familiar movements that created letters, words, lines. The rhythm of the work settled over him like a comfortable garment, and he hummed plainchant melodies while working, the music rising from some deep place that needed no conscious prompting. Brother Martin arrived later than usual, and Thomas noticed immediately that something was different. The elder scribe's silver-streaked brown hair was damp, as though he had recently washed, and his face held an unusual brightness. He carried his materials to his desk and began working, but after a few moments he turned to Thomas and, despite the rule of silence, spoke quietly. "The bees are flying," he said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying unmistakable joy. "First time in a week. The sun brought them out." Thomas smiled, understanding the significance. The monastery kept hives, and the bees' welfare mattered not just for the honey and wax they provided, but as indicators of the natural world's health. If the bees were flying despite the cold, it meant something fundamental remained right with the world, even in this strange year. He nodded to Martin, sharing the moment of gladness, and both scribes returned to their work with something lighter in the air between them. The morning hours passed in productive focus. Thomas completed the page he had been working on and began ruling the next. The routine of preparation, selecting vellum, checking for flaws, ruling the guidelines, was deeply familiar, requiring attention but not strain. His hands knew what to do, and his mind could rest in the doing without needing to direct every movement. This was the gift of long practice. The way repeated action became almost meditative, a form of prayer that required no words. Terce arrived with its invitation to pause. Thomas cleaned his quill and rose from his bench, stretching his arms overhead and feeling his spine lengthen. The walk to church took him through corridors now flooded with sunlight, the windows creating bright rectangles on the stone floors. He walked through these patches of light deliberately, feeling them on his face and hands, grateful for even this thin sunshine. In the church, the community's voices rose in the appointed psalms, and Thomas added his voice to the collective sound, his breathing synchronized with his brother's breathing, all of them together in this moment of prayer and presence. After the office, Thomas detoured to the cloister garden before returning to his work. Brother Anselm was still there, now kneeling by the bed of lavender. The plants looked stressed, their gray-green leaves tinged with brown at the edges from repeated frost, but they lived. Anselm was gently removing dead foliage, his movements patient and unhurried. Thomas watched for a moment, then continued to the Scriptorium, carrying with him an image of patient care, of tending what needed tending without guarantee of outcome. The afternoon brought different work. Thomas had decided to add marginal decoration to the page he had completed that morning, small flourishes in the margins that would echo the knotwork of the initial without overwhelming the text. He sketched these lightly in pencil first, planning their placement, ensuring they balanced across the page. The designs would be simple, spirals and tendril-like curves that suggested growth and continuity. He worked with a fine brush and diluted ink, creating delicate gray lines that seemed to grow organically from the edge of the text block. Brother Martin, working on his own manuscript, occasionally glanced over at Thomas's marginal work. The elder scribe appreciated decorative elements, though he rarely added them to his own pages, preferring to focus on the text itself and occasional botanical illustrations. But he understood their value, the way they made a page more inviting to the eye, more memorable. Thomas felt this appreciation without need for words. The way Martin's attention lingered on the emerging decorations speaking clearly enough. The midday meal brought the community to the refectory during the brightest part of the day. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, creating patterns on the tables and walls that shifted slowly as the meal progressed. Today's main dish was a stew of dried fish and root vegetables, the fish having been soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then simmered with turnips, carrots, and onions until everything was tender and the flavors had melded. Thomas ate with appreciation, tasting the different elements, the flakiness of the fish, the sweetness of the carrots, the earthy solidity of the turnips. Bread soaked in the broth became almost decadent, the liquid enriching the simple grain. After eating, Thomas walked the cloister in the sunshine. The stone paving was dry for the first time in days, the frost having evaporated under the sun's touch. He paced slowly, his hands clasped inside his sleeves, his mind quiet and receptive. Other brothers walked as well, some alone like himself, others in pairs, conversing quietly now that the midday meal had ended and speech was permitted until none. Thomas preferred solitude, finding in it a space where thoughts could arise and dissipate naturally, without need for expression or examination. The afternoon's work continued the marginal decorations. Thomas moved around the page systematically, adding flourishes that created visual rhythm without drawing attention from the main text. The work required precision but not intense concentration, and he found himself in a pleasant state between full attention and gentle drift. His humming of plain chant resumed, the melodies providing continuity as he moved from one margin to the next, one small design to another. The page was slowly becoming something more than just text. It was becoming an artifact of beauty, a thing that honored both the words it carried and the eyes that would read them. A sound from outside drew Thomas's attention, children's voices, high and bright. He looked up from his work and moved to the window. In the field beyond the monastery's kitchen garden, several village children were playing, their presence unusual during a weekday when they should have been helping with farm work. But perhaps their parents had released them for an hour, moved by the sunshine after so many cold, gray days. Thomas watched them running and calling to each other, their movements quick and unself-conscious, their laughter carrying clearly through the still air. He felt no envy of their freedom, but rather a kind of benevolent gladness that such energy and joy existed in the world. Brother Martin had also risen to look out the window. He stood beside Thomas and together they watched the children for a moment. "Life persists," Martin said quietly, and Thomas understood he was speaking not just of the children but of the bees, the struggling herbs, the community itself, all the ways that living things continued despite difficulty, finding ways to endure and even flourish. Thomas nodded, and both scribes returned to their desks, carrying this observation with them like a small light. The hours moved toward evening in their reliable progression. Thomas completed the marginal decorations and returned to straightforward copying on a new page. The text had moved beyond Saint Benedict's biography into a series of miracle stories, healings, provisions, spiritual counsel. Thomas copied each story with the same care, not judging their likelihood, but simply transmitting what the tradition had preserved. His role was not to evaluate, but to serve, to make available to future readers what had been made available to him through the scribes who came before. None arrived with the sunlight just beginning to slant toward evening angles. The office was brief, the prayers familiar, and Thomas found himself settling into that particular peacefulness that came in the latter part of the day, when most of the work was done and the evening's rhythms were beginning. The walk back to the Scriptorium took him past the kitchen, where preparations for the evening meal were underway. The scent of baking fish drifted through the door, and Thomas breathed it in, his body already anticipating the nourishment to come. The final working hour brought a natural conclusion to the day's efforts. Thomas completed another page section, reaching a point that would serve well as a stopping place. He cleaned his workspace with his usual thoroughness, ensuring that his quills were wiped and stored properly, that the inkhorn was covered, that the vellum sheets were stacked neatly and protected from dust. These small rituals of completion were as important as the work itself, marking the transition from labor to rest, from focus to release. Vespers gathered the community as the sun touched the western horizon. Through the church windows, Thomas could see the sky taking on colors, pale gold and soft pink, shading into deeper blue overhead. The Psalms spoke of evening and morning, of the cycles that governed creation, of faithfulness that endured through all changes. Thomas sang with his whole heart, his voice joining the communal sound, his ink-stained fingers folded in prayer, his close-cropped dark hair catching the last light through the windows. This moment was perfect in its ordinariness, complete in its simplicity. The evening meal brought the community to table as the natural light failed outside. Candles and rush lights provided illumination, their flames creating a warm glow that made faces softer, kinder. The fish that had been baking was served with turnips, and a sauce made from the fish stock enriched with herbs. Thomas ate slowly, savoring each bite, grateful for the skill of Brother Aelred and the others who worked in the kitchen, transforming simple ingredients into nourishment both physical and spiritual. The meal was more than fuel. It was communion, shared sustenance, that bound the community together in practical and profound ways. After Compline, the final office of the day, Thomas walked to his cell through a night transformed by clear skies. The stars were brilliant overhead, uncountable points of light that seemed closer somehow in the cold, clean air. He paused to look up, tilting his head back, letting his eyes adjust until he could see fainter stars emerging between the brighter ones. The vastness above was humbling and comforting at once, a reminder that the struggles of this strange year were small against the immensity of creation, yet also that each small thing, each copied letter, each tended plant, each day lived with attention, mattered within that vastness. In his cell, Thomas prepared for sleep with grateful tiredness. The day had been good, productive without strain, peaceful without dullness. He removed his habit and lay down under the woolen blankets, feeling their familiar weight and warmth. His body settled into the mattress with a kind of sigh, releasing the day's holding. His mind grew quiet, thoughts becoming less distinct, blending into the approach of sleep. Tomorrow would bring more work, more prayer, more community, and he welcomed it, trusted the continuation of these reliable patterns that gave his life shape and meaning. Sleep came like a benediction, settling over him with gentle completeness. His breathing deepened and slowed, his muscles released all remaining tension, and his consciousness drifted into the restorative darkness that was sleep's gift. The night continued around him, the monastery settling into its own rest, the cold air outside motionless under the brilliant stars. Brother Thomas slept deeply. His ink-stained fingers relaxed against the sheet, his 29-year-old body recovering its strength, his spirit at peace in the knowledge that he was exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what he was called to do. The morning arrived with mist. Brother Thomas woke to find the clear skies of yesterday replaced by a thick fog that pressed against his cell window, turning the world beyond into soft whiteness. The change was not unwelcome. The mist held moisture that the dry cold had lacked, and there was something comforting about the way it enclosed the monastery, making it feel even more like a world unto itself. He rose at the sound of the bell and dressed in the darkness, his movements automatic and sure. The walk to Prime took him through corridors where the mist seemed to have penetrated, creating a dampness that made the stone walls glisten slightly in the light of the rush lamps. The air smelled of water and earth, a freshness that was different from the sharp, dry cold of recent days. In the church, the brothers gathered as they always did, their forms emerging from the mist-softened darkness like shadows becoming solid. The morning psalms rose into the vaulted space, and Thomas added his voice, feeling the sound resonate in his chest, the vibration of it connecting him to the others in a way that transcended words. After the office, Thomas went directly to the Scriptorium. The mist outside the windows created a diffuse, even light that was surprisingly good for detailed work, bright enough to see clearly but without the harshness of direct sun or the gloom of overcast days. He lit a single candle at his desk, more for the comfort of its flame than for illumination, and settled onto his bench. The page he would begin today was a new section of the manuscript, starting a different saint's life, and he felt the small anticipation that came with beginning something fresh. He prepared his workspace with the rituals that had become second nature. Fresh vellum was selected and examined, its surface smooth and receptive. The ruling was done with careful attention, each line straight and evenly spaced from its neighbors. The lead point moved across the page with a faint scratching sound, barely audible but present, part of the quiet music of the Scriptorium. When the ruling was complete, Thomas sat back and looked at the prepared page, blank still but ready, full of potential. Brother Martin arrived carrying a small basket. He set it on his desk and began unpacking, not his usual copying materials, but something different. Thomas watched with curiosity as Martin lifted out several pieces of honeycomb, golden and perfect, still sealed in their wax cells. The elder scribe caught Thomas's eye and smiled. "From yesterday's hive inspection," he said softly. "Brother Anselm thought we might use wax and honey." He broke off a small piece of comb and held it out to Thomas. Thomas accepted it, touched by the gesture. He bit into the comb and sweetness flooded his mouth, the concentrated essence of summer flowers preserved in gold. The wax was pleasant to chew, releasing more honey as his teeth broke through cell after cell. It was the most intense flavor he had tasted in weeks, and he closed his eyes for a moment, simply experiencing it. When he opened them, Martin was eating a piece as well, and both scribes sat in companionable silence, savoring this unexpected gift that the bees had made during better weather and that now offered comfort during the strange cold. The honey provided energy for the morning's work. Thomas began his new page with the decorated initial, a letter M that would open the life of Saint Martin of Tours. He sketched the basic form first, planning a design that would incorporate leaves and vines, appropriate for a saint known for his connection to the natural world and the common people. The M would be large, occupying perhaps a fifth of the page, its curves graceful but sturdy, capable of supporting the decorative elements he planned to add. The morning progressed with the steady accumulation of work. Thomas moved from sketch to ink, outlining the M with confident strokes, then beginning to add the vine work that would weave through and around the letter's form. Each tendril required planning, where it would emerge, where it would loop, how it would relate to the other elements. The work was complex enough to require full attention, but not so difficult as to cause strain. He hummed plain chant melodies while working, the Kyrie giving way to the Sanctus, his voice low and rhythmic, barely more than a breath with pitch. Brother Martin, at his desk, had returned to his manuscript on beekeeping. Thomas could hear the occasional scratch of Martin's quill, the soft sound of a page turning in the exemplar, the quiet sigh of contentment that escaped the elder scribe when a passage particularly pleased him. These small sounds created a backdrop of companionship, a reminder that work could be both solitary and shared, that presence did not require constant interaction or conversation. Terce came and passed, the office brief and restorative. When Thomas returned to the Scriptorium, he found that someone had left a cup of hot herbal tea at his desk. Brother Anselm's work, surely, the infirmarian making his rounds and noticing who might benefit from warmth. Thomas picked up the cup and inhaled the steam rising from it. The scent was complex, chamomile, mint, something else he could not quite identify. He sipped carefully, the liquid almost too hot but not quite, the heat sliding down his throat and spreading through his chest. The herbs were soothing, and he drank the entire cup before returning to his illumination work, grateful for the care that had prompted this small kindness. The M was taking shape beautifully. The vines now wove completely through the letter, creating a sense of organic growth, as though the letter itself were a living thing. Thomas began adding small leaves at intervals along the vines, each leaf carefully shaped to suggest the oak leaves that Saint Martin was often associated with. The leaves would eventually be colored in green, but for now they existed only in careful black outlines, waiting for the pigment that would bring them to fuller life. The midday meal brought the community together in the refectory. Today's offering was a thick pea soup, the dried peas having been soaked overnight and then cooked with onions and a ham bone that gave the soup rich depth. Thomas ate with appreciation, using bread to capture every drop of the flavorful liquid. The soup was filling and warming, exactly what the cold, misty day required. He chewed each mouthful thoroughly, aware of the textures, the way the soft peas contrasted with the slightly chewy bread, the way the warmth settled in his belly and radiated outward. After the meal, Thomas walked to the cloister despite the mist. The covered walkway protected him from the worst of the dampness, and he found the mist-shrouded garden beautiful in its obscurity. The normal boundaries of the space were lost, the far walls invisible, creating an impression of infinite extension. Brother Anselm was visible as a dim form in the herb garden, still working despite the weather, and Thomas felt a surge of affection for the infirmarian's dedication. Some people were called to prayer, others to scholarship, but Anselm was called to tending, to the patient care of living things, and he fulfilled that calling with complete faithfulness. The afternoon's work began with color. Thomas mixed green pigment, verdigris combined with glare to create a transparent green that would allow the underlying inkwork to show through. He tested the color on a scrap of vellum, adjusting the proportions until the shade satisfied him. Too dark and the leaves would look heavy, too light and they would seem insubstantial. The balance he sought was somewhere between, a green that suggested life and growth without overwhelming the careful linework he had created. Applying the color required a different kind of attention than the ink work. The brush needed to be neither too wet nor too dry. The pigment needed to be applied evenly, and each leaf needed to be filled completely before the paint dried. Thomas worked methodically, completing one leaf before moving to the next, building up the colored elements gradually. His ink-stained fingers held the brush with the same practiced ease they held the quill, though the movements were different, less linear, more about filling space than creating lines. Brother Martin paused in his own work to watch the coloring process. "Beautiful," he murmured, and Thomas nodded acknowledgement, though his focus remained on the brush and the page. The praise was welcome, but the work itself was the thing, the doing of it well, the creation of something that would outlast both of them, that would carry beauty and knowledge forward into an unknown future. When this page was finished and bound into its manuscript, it might be read and admired for centuries. This possibility gave weight to each careful stroke, each decision about color and form. The hours of afternoon passed in absorbed work. Thomas completed the green leaves and moved on to adding touches of red to the vines, small berries that would provide visual interest and balance the cool green with warm color. The red he used was vermilion again, the same pigment he had used days before on a different initial. Its intensity was remarkable, each tiny berry seeming to glow against the vellum. He placed them carefully, ensuring they were distributed evenly across the design, creating rhythm without repetition. When he finally set down his brush and looked at the completed initial, Thomas felt the quiet satisfaction that good work brought. The M was alive with color and movement, the vines and leaves creating a frame that drew the eye without trapping it, leading naturally into the text that would follow. It was perhaps the best initial he had created in months, and he allowed himself a moment of uncomplicated pride before covering it carefully to protect it while the pigments dried fully. None arrived with the mist still thick outside. The office felt especially sheltered. The community gathered into the church while the obscured world waited beyond the walls. The Psalms spoke of refuge and safety, of God as a shelter from storms, and the words resonated with Thomas in this mist-bound afternoon. When the office concluded and he returned to the Scriptorium, he felt renewed, ready for the final hours of work that would complete the day. The text that would follow the decorated initial needed to be copied now. Thomas picked up his quill and began with the first line, his hand moving with the familiar rhythm that had become almost automatic. The story of St. Martin unfolded word by word, his early life as a soldier, the famous incident of cutting his cloak in half to share with a beggar, his eventual embrace of monastic life. Thomas knew the story well, but copying it brought fresh attention to details he had not noticed before, moments in the narrative that revealed character and choice. The work proceeded smoothly, each line adding to the ones before. Thomas's close-cropped dark hair occasionally fell forward when he leaned close to examine a letter, and he would brush it back with an unconscious gesture before continuing. His ink-stained fingers moved with their practiced sureness, never hesitating, the movements economical and efficient. The page filled gradually, the black text creating a dense block that contrasted beautifully with the decorated initial at its head. Brother Martin had lit additional candles at his desk as the afternoon dimmed toward evening. The mist outside seemed to be absorbing what little light remained, and the Scriptorium grew darker earlier than usual. Thomas lit more candles as well, creating pools of warm light around both desks. The flames wavered slightly in the air currents, sending shadows dancing across the walls and ceiling. The atmosphere became intimate, enclosed, as though the Scriptorium existed in its own small universe, separate from the mist-shrouded world beyond. Vespers called them away from their work. Thomas cleaned his quill and covered his materials, then joined the procession toward the church. The corridors were quite dark now, lit only by occasional rush lights that did little to penetrate the gloom. But the darkness was not threatening. It was simply the natural conclusion of the day, the world turning toward night as it always did. In the church, candles blazed in their holders, and the community's voices rose in the evening psalms, the sound swelling to fill the stone space with warmth and praise. The evening meal brought comfort food for a cold, misty night, a thick stew of lentils and root vegetables, seasoned with herbs and served with fresh bread. Thomas ate with appetite, his body grateful for the warmth and substance. The lentils were tender, having cooked for hours, and the vegetables had given up their flavors to the broth, creating a dish that was more than the sum of its parts. He ate 2 bowls, using bread to capture the last drops, and finished with a piece of hard cheese that Brother Anselm had set out, its sharpness a pleasant contrast to the mild stew. After Compline, Thomas walked to his cell through air that was thick with moisture. The mist had not lifted, and now in the darkness it seemed even more present, beating on his habit, clinging to his eyelashes. He could see only a few feet in any direction, the rest of the world dissolved into soft whiteness. but he knew the way by heart, his feet finding the path without need for vision, his body moving with the confidence that came from years of traversing these same stones. In his cell, Thomas found that the dampness had penetrated even here. The blankets on his bed felt slightly moist when he touched them, and the air held a clamminess that was not quite cold but not comfortable either. He added an extra blanket from the small chest where spare linens were kept, building up layers that would trap his body's warmth and keep him comfortable through the night. When he finally lay down, the bed felt welcoming despite the damp, and he pulled the blankets up to his chin, creating a cocoon against the misty night. His body was tired in the way that came from sustained focus rather than physical exertion. His eyes felt heavy, and his mind was already beginning to release the day's concerns. He thought briefly of the completed initial, the vines and leaves now dry and permanent, and felt satisfaction in having created something beautiful. Then his thoughts became less formed, drifting like the mist outside, and sleep rose up to meet him, pulling him down into its restoring darkness. The monastery settled into night, each brother in his cell, the community dispersed but still bound together by shared purpose and mutual care. The mist pressed close against the walls, softening all edges, muffling all sounds. Brother Thomas slept deeply, his breathing slow and regular, his 29-year-old body recovering from the day's work, his ink-stained fingers relaxed against the sheet. Outside, the world was reduced to whiteness and dampness, but inside the thick stone walls, all was safe and still and peaceful. The night would pass, morning would come, and the work would continue, the reliable rhythm that gave meaning and shape to every day.